Hi everyone, welcome back. Today in this video we're going to be discussing about migration using PostgreSQL, Sequelize ORM in the Node.js application. For those of us who are conversant with building backend applications, API endpoints, I'm very sure we've dealt with several kinds of databases, from relational databases to NoSQL or non-relational databases. And for you to have a very professional application, you need to have your database as a single source of truth. You've been able to run several migrations to updating data in your database. What exactly is migration, or why is migration needed? Migration is basically you being able to make changes to your database and being able to revert changes to your database. So in that sense, it keeps a previous state of your database and you're able to track each changes that was made to your database. If you really want to build a very professional application, an application that will be used by several users, thousands of users, migration is the best and professional way to handle your database calls and your database requests. And in this video, I'm going to be walking you through how to run migrations in PostgreSQL databases using Sequelize ORM. Having explained all of that, let's dive straight into the practical approach of the video. So if you need the complete code base for this particular tutorial and this particular project, you can have it in the GitHub repository. I'm going to drop the link in the description below. But for those of you who want to follow me through the process while I explain everything one step at a time, then you can join me on the journey. Now, for the first part of this particular tutorial, what we have to do is just set up a very simple Node server, not really on the Node side of things, but just a very simple project folder for our Node, for our migration in the database. Now, I've created a folder called Sequelize Postgres migration node. You can have any folder name of your choice. All I just want to do now is I'm going to open up this. I'm going to create like a new file inside of here, which is just going to be index.js. And let me open up this in the terminal. So I'm going to open up this in the new terminal. And then just to be sure we're on the right terminal here. So the next thing I want to do is initialize a package.json so that we can be able to install dependencies. And now we have a package.json initialized. And the next thing I would do here is just to install the dependencies which we'll be working with. And for our own case, like I said, we're not dealing with the Node server. We're not doing all of those things. What we are basically doing is just the migration aspect of things. So the dependencies that I'm going to be installing is the Postgres dependencies, the Sequelize dependency, Express, and the Sequelize CLI, so that we can run some Sequelize command within the project terminal. So I'm going to install PG, which is basically the project and the Postgres dependency that is being used in Sequelize and Node. And I'm also going to install pghstore, which is also used alongside with Postgres, and I'm also going to add Sequelize. So these three packages are going to be installed and added into our application. And once they're added, the next thing we're going to be installing is the dev dependency, which we'll be working with. And in our own case, we're going to be working with Sequelize CLI. So right now, if you check the dependency, you would see we have PG, we have pghstore, and we have Sequelize. Now I'm going to also install, I'm going to add the Sequelize CLI. So I'm going to install the Sequelize CLI. Now with the help of Sequelize CLI, like I said earlier, we can be able to run Sequelize commands within our application, like the Sequelize init and all of those kind of commands and scripts. Now, having installed that, the first thing we'll be doing here is npx Sequelize init. Now this would create a config.json file, also create a folder for our migrations, seeders, and models. And in our case, we're going to be dealing with migrations, which is where all our migration script is going to be. Our models is like a schema for our database, and the seeders is when you want to deal with dummy data, like just to seed your application. For our own case, we're not going to be working with seeders, so that would be removed. We don't need the seeders for now. So what we need here is the config, the migration, and the models. Now, the next thing I would want to do here, or the next thing we have to do here, is we have to go inside of the config.json, and you can see that we have some pre-updated informations for our databases. So when you're on development, your database username is root, your password is null, the database is this. When you're on test, you have this. When you're on production, you also have this. But we're going to be making a very slight change from what we have right now to something else. But before we bring in that change, I'm going to create a new file, not inside of the config, but outside of the config. I'm going to create a new file called env.env file. And the reason why we're going to be creating a .env file is basically because I want to put in the DB name. I also want to put in the DB hosts. I also want to put in the DB password and also the DB user. Now, for these particular informations, it might be slightly different from mine and yours because of whatever Postgres database you have set up, on your own end. But in my own case, for my DB name, I'm going to be using test DB. For my DB hosts, it's going to be local hosts. I'm also going to be using my password, and I'm also going to be using my user as Postgres. Now, this is what I have in my local computer. This is what I have in my local computer. And because I'm dealing with my databases on my local computer, that's why I have this. So now, the next thing would be to change this from a JSON to a JS file so that we can be able to export it and be able to also use the env inside of here. Like being able to extract these things and use them inside of here. So we have to change this to a JS file. And the next step would be to go inside of the models, find the index.js file, and also change this from JSON to JS. And when you save this, you no longer have the error here. But there's something we need to do here. This is not how to export information from a JS. So we have to switch this. But before we can switch this, since we're going to be making use of the .env, that's the .env package, we also would have to, add the .env package in our application. So while that is going on, okay, that has been added. Now, while we have that added, let's just confirm that we have it there. And yes, we can see that we have it there. So for the config.js, we're going to switch all of these things to something else. So I'm just going to copy what I have from one of my applications, which I've pre-built before now. And I'm just going to copy all of that and paste it right inside of here. Now, what can you see is the difference between what we have now and what we have before? You would notice that we are now able to make use of the data or the value coming from the env file because this is a JS file and no longer a JSON file. And aside from that, we are also able to require this package, which allows us to access values from our env application, from our env file, which is where we have the DB user, the DB password, the DB name, and the DB host. Now, for the dialect, dialect is basically like what kind of relational database are you dealing with. In my own case or our own case, it's Postgres. But if it's MySQL, it's going to be MySQL. If it's whatever other kind of database is going to be there. For you to have clarity of this, you can go to the documentation. That's the the Sequelize documentation. They have everything there. If you go to get started, if you want to install MySQL, if you want to work with MariaDB, if you want to work with SQLite, if you want to work with Tedious or Oracle. But in our own case, we're working with Postgres. As you can see, that was the reason why earlier we had to install PG and also had to install pghstore. Now, that is basically that. So we've been able to install that, and the next step would be to now create a new migration in our application. And let's take, for example, we have a user table, and our user table would have first name, last name, email address. Now we want to create that table in our database. It makes no sense going into the database, to start writing queries inside of here, trying to create a new table and all of those kind of stuff. Because take the use case whereby you have to push this application online to production. Would you have to go into your production database to start creating tables? That's wrong. So that is the reason why we have the migrations in place. Now, if you look at the documentation here, for you to create a new migration, we've been able to do this, which initializes the project and the whole folder for us. The next thing would be to create the first model and the migration. And for you to create a new model, which also generates a migration file, all you have to do is just take this command, and I'm going to copy this command right now, and inside of here I'm going to paste that command. And the command is basically npx sequelize model generates. We're generating a user schema, and in the schema we want the first name column, the last name column, and the email address. Now when I run this, I get a new model file called user, and I also get a new migration file which have all of the attributes, which is also called columns, and each of these columns have their own types, which we can also add other properties and other configurations to each column. And right now we can be able to migrate this column into the database, and it automatically gets created. And in Sequelize, there is a package for that. I'm sorry, there's a command for that rather. And because we're going to be running that command all the time, I wouldn't want to do that from the terminal all the time. So I'll go into the package.json and create the command, which is basically migrate. And here I would have npx sequelize CLI db migrate. And the next thing I would also have down, which is to on migrate, if there's a word like that. And this would basically be npx sequelize CLI db migrate undo. So now with this, if we go ahead and run this migration, but before we run the migration, I just want to point out some stuffs to you guys. Like for example, right now you can see we have an ID with a primary key and auto increment, which means for every new data you put into the database, the ID auto increases by itself. It cannot allow a null value and other kind of configurations for the ID. I'm just going to copy this same thing for the first name. We don't want the first name to be blank, so we want the first name to be there. We also want the last name to be there. We also want the email address to be there. Now we have this, and the next thing we want to do now is just run a migration npm run migrate. Now why am I using npm run migrate? Normally what I'm supposed to do is write out all of these things, and put it here, but because we're going to be running other migrations, I don't want to be typing those things same time again. So that's the reason why I had to add it here as a command. So when I run npm run migrate and I click on enter, you can see it tells you configuration file, whatever. It says using environment development, and right now it has created a migration for you. So which means when you go to the database and check the table, now you can see we have a user table, and if you open the user table, we have all the columns that we needed: ID, first name, last name, email, created at and updated at as something that comes at default with Postgres and Sequelize. And you would notice we have another table which we did not create, which is basically the Sequelize meta. And what this table does for you is it keeps track of all the migrations that was done in your application. So if you open up this, you would find out that you get some information here. Right now you're getting this, and this is because this was the first migration that we ran. And if you check this, you would notice that it's exactly the same name with the migration file that was here. So we ran this migration, and that's the reason why we're keeping track of this migration here. So the Sequelize meta table keeps track of all the migrations that are run or that are running in your application. And right now we have the user table with all the fields that we created. That's basically how a migration works in an application. In our own case, this is a Node.js application. And yeah, that's it. So moving forward, when you're dealing with applications, there are cases where you might want to create some stuff, you might want to add new columns, you might want to do some updates to some columns in your application, and all those kind of stuff that comes up when you're dealing with servers and API endpoints. And right now we have first name, last name, email. Now, on the course of developing your application, there might be a need for you to create a new column in your database, and that column might be called address. So take, for example, we need to add an address field. How do you expect to add an address field? Would you want to go into your database and start creating a new table? Definitely no, you wouldn't want to do that. And the best way to do that efficiently without having to affect anything in your application is just to run a new migration. And when you run a new migration, it updates what you have in your database. And for the sake of running a new migration, what do? All you need to do is you can come to the documentation here. And when you come to the documentation, there is a command to create a new migration file. That's somewhere here. I think we have it here. Let me look for that. Yes, this is where we have it. This is a script to do that. And now when you paste this here, this is different from the first one we had, because the first one created the model and created a migration file. But we're no longer creating a model because we already have the user model. The only thing we're doing right now is we're trying to add a new column. We're trying to update the user table. So I'm going to name this, I'm going to name it add address field to user table. So when I create this would create a new migration file, and this is the migration file. And right now you will notice that when we created the first migration, we had a lot of stuff inside of it. But this new migration does not have anything because you have to be the one to put in what you want to put in there. Understand? So for our own case, what we want to do here is basically have await query interface, and we want to run the add column. And in the add column, we want to put users, which is, this ours is users, which is the name of our table. And the new column we want to put there is address. Now we've put that. Now the next thing would be to specify all the configurations for the address. The first thing we'll do is the type has to be Sequelize.string because it's going to be a string. Allow null, we want to allow null, so which means it can be a null value. Then the default value should be null. So which means if you don't provide an address, automatically it's going to be null. And for the down, it basically awaits query interface remove column, and we're removing the address from the user column. Now, what's the difference between down and up? Because you can notice that here also we also have down and up. Now when you run a migration, whatever you have here is what gets executed. When you undo a migration, whatever you have here is what gets executed. So which means if we run this migration now, this is the next thing that would execute. And if we undo the last migration, this is what we're going to have. So if I have this now and I run here, I try to run npm run migrate, you'd notice that this has been migrated successfully. And now if we check our DB, refresh our DB, you find out we now have an address column in our table. And that's because we've run a new migration that automatically added an address column to every user in the table. And just for us to confirm, if we go to the Sequelize meta, you find that we now have a new history added because we ran this new migration here. That's what we ran. The first one was the create user, the second one was the add address field to the user table. Now we have a history of 2 migrations that was executed. Now for some reason we might decide that, okay, we want to remove the address field. We don't want to have the address field anymore for the users, all right? We want to do away with that. And all you have to do is, you don't have to go into your database and start deleting data and start deleting columns, messing everything around. All you just have to do is just npm run down, and automatically it reverts the last migration that was done. And in our case, the last migration that was done was adding an address field to the user table. And now if you go straight to the user table and try to refresh this, you find out that we no longer have an address field. And every other thing we have remains the same. If you go to the Sequelize meta and try to check this, you find out that we no longer have the address migration because that has been removed from the history of the migration. And that's the beauty migration gives to you when you're working with databases. You know, it lets you update your database in a very smooth process without having to affect anything in your database in production, without having to mess around anything with your data. It just gives you a very full functionality of you being able to easily add data, update your databases, change your columns, change your data types, all sort of stuff that you can do with database. Sequelize ORM allows you to do that via migration. And this is exactly what I just want to show you guys today, because this is the beauty of working with Sequelize ORM. Being able to make changes to your database without, going into your database, messing around with stuff. So this is basically what we'll be walking you through today. If you want to get more insight of, how migration works, how Sequelize works and everything, you can go to the sequelize.org. It has the documentation for everything that you need to understand. But the sake of this video is to show you how to easily update your database, add data to your database, add columns to your database, and all of those stuff. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I was able to explain in a very simple term the best way to work with database. And yeah, like I said earlier on, this is not applicable to only Postgres. You can have this done with any relational database as long as you have Sequelize ORM working alongside with it. And you can find that here. These are all the databases that are supported. We have MySQL, MariaDB, SQLite, and the rest of them. So if you want to play around with other kinds of database, you can check them out. For our own case, we had to use Postgres, but if you want to use MySQL, same thing applicable to that. I hope I've been able to explain this in details, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you do, you can give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, because more amazing videos will be released, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. I'm going to be releasing nice videos. And if you have anything you want to add to this video, the comment section is widely open. You can add that if you want. If you feel we need to, do a new video from what we have now concerning other kind of databases, you can add that. If you experience any error while trying to set this up the same way I did, you can also point that out in the comment section, and I'll be there to answer all your questions. But for now, we have to put a pause to the video because we've come to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.